Welcome to Blackbird Writers Presents. I am Tracy S. Phillips, and first I want to give a huge shout out to all of our listeners today for helping us to become an award-winning podcast. Thanks so much for being here today. I am so lucky to be chatting with donalee Moulton, who is an award-winning author from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Her byline has appeared in over 100 publications across North America, including Canadian Business, The Chatelaine, Equinox, Ford Times, Maclean's, The Globe and Mail, and The National Post. Her most recent book, Conflagration, won the 2024 Daphne du Maurier Award for Excellence in Historical Mystery. Her other books include a murder mystery based in Nova Scotia and a nonfiction book about effective communications. Today, we'll be discussing Bind, which hit the shelves in February. Welcome, donalee.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. We've chatted before, so it's so good to see you again. And I think the last time I was with you, we were talking about your book, Hung Out to Die, right?
That was my very first foray into full-length fiction.
Oh, wow. So I don't think I ever asked, how did you get started as a writer, as a fiction writer?
When I was in university, when I was in high school, I wrote poetry and I wrote short stories. And I think, like many of us, that seed was planted and I wanted to water it and let it grow. But life comes along, right? And you get busy with career and work, and it's always on the back burner that you're going to write the book. And I remember being in the bathtub one night and I said, "Now, donalee, you've got to think about this book." And my other voice said, "Oh, good Lord, you're still talking about that. Either do it or shut up." Right? And so by the time I got out of the bath, I had the character for Hung Out to Die. I had the very, very roughest of a plot. And then I started to write.
That's a great story. It happens to all of us at some point. We get the call, they say, right?
Well, and I
Um,
think you get a tiny little bit of fear that if I don't do it now, I'm not going to, right?
right.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I feel like, no regrets, right?
exactly.
Yeah. So I know from our previous conversation that you and I share a love of yoga. And Bind, this most recent book, is a yoga practitioner's dream. It is a heist mystery that takes place mostly in the yoga studio. And it has all of the peaceful elements of yoga, the incense, the tea, the poses, and a little bit of humor, all wrapped around the heist of one very, very expensive watch.
Very expensive.
Yes. So
Who
set up,
knew?
yeah, exactly. Set up this story for us.
Well, and you've done it beautifully. When I wrote Hung Out to Die, the main character is male. I'm not. The main character is American. I'm Canadian. The main character is ambitious and youthful. And of course, he's a psychopath, which I will very quickly say I am not. So this was a character that came to me in the bathtub, and I thought, well, this is the direction I'm being pointed in. This is the direction I'm going to go in. But if you had asked me, is this the kind of book you would ever see yourself writing, I would have said, no, no. I would write something where the main characters were female, where the main characters were more laid back, where the main characters were doing something wonderful like yoga. So I did Hung Out to Die, and I followed it with the historical mystery, which was part of my publisher's series, and then settled in to write the book that felt most like me. Love the other books, hold them very dear to my heart. But this is the book that feels like the comfortable pair of pajamas. Yes, this is what I'm going to get cozy in, right?
Yeah.
And so because of that, I think the women are closer to my age. There's three of them. They have diverse backgrounds and diverse careers. They're not necessarily friends, I don't think, when the book starts. They are women who meet in a yoga studio, and you know what that's like. We're all friendly with one another. We all inquire about our day and our weekend. And they are also women who come with particular skills, skills that are going to help them during this heist. And so I think because they were amateur detectives or amateurs in the sense of crime, and because they didn't know each other very well, I thought I can't start with a murder. That's too much. I'm not going to toss them into the middle of a murder and expect that they are really going to help out with the murder. But there are some things that they can do and did do in the book that help to catch the thief.
Right. And I loved how they all work together using their specific skill sets and to help solve the crime. So your three characters were Lexi, Christy. Well, I was thinking four characters because of Charlene and Woo Woo, right?
And that's right. For me, the three main characters are Lexi, Charlene, and Woo Woo. Christy is the yoga instructor, and the first book really pivots around a situation that Christy finds herself in as co-owner of this gym and yoga studio. And Christy comes back in the next book, Melt, but she plays a lesser role. Charlene, Lexi, and Woo Woo will remain the main characters throughout.
Right. So talk a little bit about their specific traits.
How you decide you're going to create a character and then they become the character that they were meant to be. So
Yeah.
yeah, I wanted three women who could have a shared foundation. In part, that's yoga. In part, that's the community in which they live. In part, that's their age. Um, but I also wanted women with very different personalities. So Charlene is our auditor. And I don't want to stereotype auditors, but Charlene has that organized, precise brain that likes to see things aligned. And when things don't make sense, she wants to figure out why they don't
Mhm.
make sense. Lexi is the comedian, and comedian by profession, not just by, you know, personality.
Right.
And she is a little bit more down to earth. Perhaps she's a little bit more sarcastic, but she also understands what it's like to present one side of yourself to the world when that's not all of your sides and may not even be the biggest side. So she's very good at reading people. And then there's Woo Woo, bless her heart, who came, I don't even know how that name came about, but you can figure out what it means, right? And I'm quite enamored of Woo Woo because I don't know what the hell she is, right? Like she's part wonderful, warm, caring person. She's part empath. She's, I don't, but she's just there
Yeah.
and people gravitate towards her. And she's just genuinely nice and surprisingly filthy rich.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was a surprise.
To me too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And she acts like an old hippie, you know. And so I
absolutely.
think that's sort of why she got her name Woo Woo, right?
And I don't want to make her woo woo has the ability to connect with people and perhaps not necessarily people who are still walking among us, but I don't see her as she's not a psychic, she's
Mhm.
not a medium, she's not any of those kinds of things, but she's just open to possibilities. And sometimes the possibilities are a little stranger for woo woo than they are for the rest of us.
Yeah. I loved her. So then you bring in Detective Terrell. Terrell or Terrell?
I would have said Terrell, but you don't
Okay,
say it when you're writing it, right?
right. And as a reader, I was trying to pronounce it, and I wasn't sure whether it was Terrell or Terrell. So,
I'm sure in Nova Scotia it would be Terrell.
okay. So, yeah, introduce the detective for us. He's great.
And the detective was supposed to be that, right? These are three women who meet in a yoga studio where a watch gets stolen. They don't have the resources or the experience to solve this crime. So from the get-go, I knew that there were going to be police involved, right? But I didn't know that Terrell would have such a key role to play. And he goes on in the second book to play an equally important role. And he may or may not be starting to have a relationship with Woo Woo, but he's this quintessential cop, right? He's big, he's black, he's in law enforcement, he's dependable, he's sturdy, he's no nonsense, he's seen it all. And now he's got these three strange women in a yoga studio, and he's trying to help them, and they're trying to help him. And it's like his world is somewhat upended. And I kind of like that he goes very professionally about doing his job, but at the same time, he's aware that he may be walking on marshmallows with this particular case.
Yeah. And so they depend on him uh, to help solve the crime, but they also like come to him with things that they find, right?
Yeah, I think there's a very symbiotic relationship there.
Yeah.
Like any police officer, he does not want them getting involved because they don't know what they're doing. That, of course, is not going to stop them. But at some point, he also realizes that these women just might be able to get him into places he can't get into as a cop without putting them in any kind of danger whatsoever.
Right.
So he is prepared with some thought to ask some favors of them.
Yeah. So it never occurred to me that watches could be so valuable.
Oh, and when I started out thinking, well, there's a theft. It's an expensive watch. And I looked at expensive watches, the Rolexes of this world, and quickly discovered that Rolex is an absolutely fabulous watch, but there are many other very expensive, exclusive watches out there. It was one of the issues that my beta readers raised, actually, because I assumed if something got stolen, the police would investigate, right? My readers said that they didn't think the police would investigate. They thought the police would kind of just shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's a shame. We'll keep an eye on the pawn shops or something.
Right.
And I kept trying to reinforce that this watch could be worth 60,000. It could be worth 80,000. It could be worth more than 100,000. So I
Right.
went back into the book and tried to present comparables. So this watch is the same value as a Porsche.
Right.
And if a Porsche
Right.
got stolen, we would investigate the theft. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. I was thinking that it's worth more than my car, probably.
Probably worth more than both of our cars put together.
Yeah. Um, yeah, which made it, so much more interesting too. And then I had to go and look up what is a Nautilus 7010. So,
Yeah. And I had to that same regard, I had to kind of, I wanted to find a watch. This is a Philippe Patek, which does not mean anything to me until I started to do research. But it's up there with on the Rolex spectrum. We've all heard the Rolex name, right? But we just haven't heard the other exclusive names. And when you go into the stores and their site, you find that they, of course, have a full range. And the type of watch becomes very important because one, it sets the price. It also determines what it looks like. It also determines whether it's a new watch or an old watch, whether it's part of their current lineup or their old lineup. The character that owns the watch, to be honest, I don't think he particularly cares one way or the other about the watch. He just wants
Right.
people to be able to look at his wrist and see this shiny bauble and say, "Oh, he must be important."
Important, right. Yeah, yeah. Um, so then you're telling the story because, and we talked about the characters that are all involved in this. You are telling the story from an omniscient point of view. And I especially love that with the yoga scenes where you can kind of, you know, be, saying so and so is doing this, so and so struggling with the pose, um, and honey farted, and I just had to say that on the
Honey
video
does
because
that a lot.
it's so funny, because we all know that, during yoga that happens,
Absolutely.
right? But you're good at quickly conveying the multiple feelings and the multiple points of view without overwhelming the reader. I mean, I've read books where it feels like head hopping, you know, and this did not feel like that at all.
Well, and I am so glad that you said that because that was a real concern. When I wrote Hung Out to Die, it was my first book. And while I had read many, many mysteries and seen different points of view, I wanted people to see inside Rial's mind. So it was a first person. If Rial wasn't in the room, we couldn't talk about it in the book. Conflagration is the historical mystery, and likewise, given the sensitive nature of the crime and the enslaved Black woman who was convicted, I told it through one person's eyes who was following the trial. So this was a book where I didn't have to do that, and now I have three characters, not one. And I thought, how do I do it without confusing people? And all of a sudden, other people started to speak up. Like you say, in yoga class, we're finding out what Bodhi is thinking. We're finding out what Philip is thinking, all of these kinds of things. At one point, there is a dog I'm particularly fond of. There was never supposed to be a dog, and all of a sudden there is a dog. And every once in a while, we'll even hear from the dog, right?
Right.
And when you're writing it, you know it so well, and you think, yes, this is okay. No one's going to be um, confused by the different points of view. But it's always there in the back of your mind that this is risky. And I do want to be sure that I'm not doing it at the expense of the clarity and the enjoyment of the reader. So I'm glad you didn't find it distracting.
Yeah, not at all.
Okay,
And
good.
it was good because, I mean, there was definitely times where it warranted, um, more clarity. And I think that helped get the reader to, the conclusions that you were trying to draw.
Good.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so what did you have to do any research for this book?
Question. And the answer is yes and no. So this was the book when, the first book, Hung Out to Die, was set in a cannabis corporation. My background is in freelance journalism, and I had written for the cannabis sector. So I had a little bit of knowledge, but I had to do a lot more research. My main character is a psychopath, as I like to say, the nice kind of psychopath. There's no serial killing, there's no violence, but I had to research that as a mental health issue, and I had to kind of learn police procedure in terms of investigating a murder. And conflagration, of course, took place in 1734. So I had to learn all about that particular era. I had to learn all about the trial. So now comes this breath of fresh air. I know women, right? I know yoga, right? I know the community that they live in. I'm golden. And of course, you're never golden, right?
Right.
I have to look up exactly what it is that an auditor does and doesn't do, and what, little things like, can you trace a cell phone if it's turned off? Because you can't on Law and Order, but apparently in real life you can. So
Yeah.
it's those kinds of things. There's a thousand little questions. There wasn't the intensity of saying, well, I'm going to take 3 or 4 weeks and just read everything I can on psychopaths. But there was, like I say, these million little questions that pop up that you have to be very careful about getting right.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. So I'm really curious now about Conflagration, which is the book that released, do you say 2024?
yep, came out last year.
Okay. Tell us about that.
Well, and that's the one, this is my standard, and this is part of the background of being a freelance journalist. You know, you get a call from an editor who says, I work for a trucking magazine. Could you do us a story on the new tires coming out in 2025? And you say, I know nothing about tires and trucks. And they say, well, we pay 50 cents a word. And you say, well, absolutely, I could learn about trucks. How difficult can it be, right? And so Conflagration was very much the same. Conflagration is part of a series that my publisher has that spans the Canadian provinces and territories. And in each province and territory, there is a historical mystery woven around something that happened or an era in that province. She unexpectedly lost her Quebec writer and reached out to me and said, donalee, would you be able to step in and write this book? And here is the story we're writing. It's the story of Marie-Joseph Angelique. And I joke and I say, well, Quebec, of course, is French. I don't live in Quebec. I've never lived in Quebec. I don't speak French. And I do not do history. So of course I said, yes, absolutely. I'll write the book. You know, like what? And that's the kind of freelance background that says you're less likely to be daunted by the stuff you don't know because you
Right.
know how to find out. And in the case of Angelique, the trial was documented and thoroughly documented. So every witness, every bit of testimony, every writ is all in the Montreal archives. Of course, it's in French and it's also in Old French.
Oh,
But yeah, but there's at least one site and another as well that have translated most of those documents. And then, of course, there's a number of translations. Even some of the translations that they had, I then had to go in and use different translation software to try to figure out what it was saying, because it doesn't translate easily. You know, what we
right,
call a shoe in 2025, they did not call a shoe in 1734.
right. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So it,
As a total aside, I was going to say February is Black History Month,
right.
and the Canadian Canada Post released a stamp, and the stamp is Marie-Joseph Angelique in celebration of her story and the trial that she went through. Now, of course, no one knows what she looked like because there would never have been any images of her. So it's a rendering, it's an artist's rendering, and it is absolutely lovely. But it's also wonderful to know that her story continues to live on.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's wonderful when stories like that get pulled out of um, you know, the files, the
Yeah.
archives. Yeah, really great. I bet it was really fun for you to be involved with that.
It was a learning curve on many levels. It was a learning curve about doing the research. It was a learning curve about writing history, things you don't think about. You know, I had my character get up one morning to get ready for work, and I had him go to get a cup of coffee, and I thought, did they drink coffee in 1734? You know, everything
Yeah,
has to be checked. And that was also the nerve-wracking part because you don't want to get it wrong.
right. Exactly. Yeah. How interesting. So, on your website, you offer a lot of editorial services, including coaching and proofreading. Um, what is the biggest piece of advice that you can give to writers who are just getting started?
What I found is really two things. I found that for many writers, the story comes and they put the story down, and like we all do at the end, we go, oh, isn't this wonderful? I've done a draft. This is great. And then they think it's done. So my first piece of advice is it's not done. It's just getting started. And you have to be prepared for all of the work that is now about to follow. And I think my second piece of advice is, because you've got to be prepared for all of the work that's about to follow, you've got to develop that second skin, because people are going to change it and they are going to make suggestions and they're going to cross stuff out and they're going to say, no, this character needs to go and this character needs to be built up. And so the thicker that skin, the easier life will be.
Absolutely. And that's so true. And I think as a beginning writer, you don't know what you don't know, right? And there are so many writers. I mean, the writing community to me is the best community of professionals that I've ever been in part of, because everybody's so willing to share and share their knowledge and to help. So,
I must admit, I think that's important. I think that I am always amazed at the generosity of
mhm,
writers to everybody, but particularly to other writers and those who are starting out.
yeah, absolutely. So, this video is going to be aired, I think, in April. So, the book Bind is now available where?
It's available on Amazon. It's available through my publisher, BWL Publishing, Barnes and Noble, all of the traditional sites where you would lay your hands on a book.
Yeah,
Bind is available.
and Conflagration.
And Conflagration and Hung Out to Die. Yeah.
Yes, wonderful. What's next? What are you writing next?
I am, again, it's an interesting, life is interesting, isn't it? So when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with Bind and if Bind was ready, I started on book 2. So Melt is coming out in August. So Melt will be the next story that involves these 3 women from the yoga studio. And in 2026, my publisher has a series now that spans from coast to coast on paranormal mysteries,
Oh,
right? And so I'm doing the paranormal mystery for Nova Scotia. And when I said yes, I'd be delighted to do that, I then turned to my friend and said, what's paranormal? Right? Right. I was thinking alien, she was thinking ghost. So I spent some time kind of looking into what exactly paranormal means, and I now have the very, very roughest of an outline as to what that book will be.
wonderful. That's exciting because that's what I'm publishing this year.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah. So
Do
we'll
you
chat
think,
later.
yeah, I was going to say, do you think, this is my question to you now, paranormal by its very nature is otherworldly of some kind, but I don't think that necessarily means it has to be creepy, right?
It doesn't, but usually it is for some,
Mm,
and then paranormal also encompasses all of the, vampires, werewolves, and that. I mean, and that's kind of also fantasy as well. But paranormal is, I think anything relating to like spirit and, you
yes.
know, um, extrasensory perception, that kind of thing too.
This
So it's a
series,
pretty broad term.
and this particular series is based not in reality as we know it, but it's based on the urban myths or the ghost centers or the alien centers that around which over years have come up stories and people have experienced things. So much
Hauntings.
like the historical fiction, it's being rooted in something specific to that location.
Right. Like hauntings and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love it.
I will be reaching out.
Okay. Where can our viewers find you if they want more information about books to come?
Look, would love to hear from you. donalee Moulton.com. lots of information about me and contact information. It would be great to connect.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing this time with me.
Look, thank you. This has been wonderful.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.